Imagine holding a medical document that proves your child's brain development, relies on a gene mutation shared by like fewer than 800 people on Earth.
Yeah, that is a staggering reality to process.
Right. You have this incredibly rare, complex medical reality right in your hands. And then, imagine taking that reality, walking into your local neighborhood school, and just being handed a standard generic learning plan.
Which is usually designed for very general learning delays. Maybe just a little extra reading help.
Exactly. The gap between those two realities is it's a chasm. And falling into that chasm is, it's the greatest fear for any parent of a child with complex needs. So today we are talking directly to you. If you are listening to this, you are likely a parent or a carer of a child who has been diagnosed with PURA syndrome. So welcome to today's deep dive.
It's a profound transition, really, moving from that very clinical setting of a genetic diagnosis into, well, the bureaucratic machinery of the school system.
Oh, completely.
Because those are two entirely different languages, and unfortunately, they just do not naturally translate to one another.
No, they don't. And that is exactly our mission today. We are going to bridge that gap. We are mapping out a step-by-step, really tactical guide on how to navigate the Education, Health, and Care Plan system, the EHCP in the UK.
And we really want to stress that we are not going to just hover at a high administrative altitude today.
No, we are getting into the absolute granular details, like how to apply what specific evidence you need, and the exact mechanics of securing the support your child legally deserves.
To do this, we've synthesized a really vast amount of source material. We're drawing deeply from the SEND and U guidelines.
Right, which you might see abbreviated as SAY in some of the literature.
Exactly, SAY. And they provide highly detailed statutory advice for parents in the UK regarding special educational needs. We're also integrating the IPSEA checklist.
That stands for the Independent Provider of Special Education Advice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. They are a phenomenal legal charity that helps families navigate the law surrounding special education. Plus, we're combining those legal frameworks with clinical databases for human disease genes, specifically zeroing in on the genetic profile of PURA.
And finally, cross-referencing all of that with the official UK government SEN Code of Practice protocols.
It is a mountain of paperwork.
It is. But, the EHCP isn't just a piece of paper. And it certainly isn't a set of polite suggestions for a local school to consider if they have the time.
Oh, absolutely not.
When it is finalized, it is the legal framework protecting your child's future. It's a legally binding contract that essentially forces the system to act.
Precisely. And the bureaucracy surrounding it is, well, it's objectively daunting. It's actually built to be a rigorous threshold.
Built to keep people out, almost.
In a way, yes. But understanding the architecture of that bureaucracy, like understanding exactly why the local authority is asking certain questions and why funding is released in the way that it is, that gives parents the ultimate advantage.
Right, because the system operates on strict rules.
Exactly. When you learn the mechanics of those rules, you stop asking the system for a favor and you start holding it legally accountable.
So before we even get to the application itself, we need to establish the foundation. We have to clearly define exactly what it is we are asking the system to support. Let's look at the unique intersection of PURA syndrome and education.
It's a very specific intersection.
Yeah, like why does a diagnosis of PURA almost automatically necessitate a rigorous, highly specialized educational plan? Why can't a school just, figure this out on the fly?
Well, we really have to begin with the clinical reality of PURA. First and foremost, the sheer rarity of the condition dictates the response. Based on our clinical sources from June 2025, there are only about 750 to 800 patients identified worldwide.
Wait, 800 people on the entire planet?
On the entire planet.
Wow. That means a standard local authority or regional school district has a statistical probability of practically zero of ever having seen a child with this condition before.
That's exactly right. And the genetic root is incredibly specific. It's caused by a mutation or sometimes a deletion in the PURA gene.
Right.
This is located on chromosome 5, specifically at position 5q31.3.
Okay, that sounds like a tiny, almost microscopic coordinate on the human map. But what does that specific mutation actually do to a child's body development?
So that mutation leads to a significant reduction in the levels of the PURA protein. And the PURA protein is not just some localized element. It is absolutely vital for normal brain development.
Okay.
It's crucial for the growth of nerve cells and fundamentally dictates the way nerve signals are transmitted throughout the entire body.
So If the nerve signals aren't firing correctly from the brain down, I mean, this isn't just a learning delay. It affects every single system.
It is a profoundly multi-system condition. And for an EHCP, we need to translate how those systemic medical issues manifest physically and then logically connect that to cognitive and educational challenges.
Right, make that bridge.
Exactly. For infants with PURA, they often present with excessive sleepiness, exceptionally low body temperature, and severe breathing issues. Now, the source data shows us that these specific infantile symptoms typically resolve around 1 year of age.
But those early delays must cause a sort of cascading effect as the child enters early childhood and school age.
They absolutely do. The most pervasive ongoing physical challenge is hypotonia.
Which is low muscle tone.
Yes, severe low muscle tone resulting in generalized weakness. This leads to massive delays in motor development. We are talking about severe difficulties learning to roll, to sit independently, to crawl, and to walk.
Wow.
In fact, many children with PURA never develop the ability to walk independently due to poor balance and a very unsteady gait.
So we have to think about how that translates to a school environment. Hypotonia isn't just about, not being able to run in the playground.
No, not at all.
It means the core muscles required to simply sit upright in a standard plastic classroom chair are constantly working overtime. By late morning, a child with hypotonia is often physically exhausted.
That is the exact translation we need to be making for the paperwork. Because when physical exhaustion sets in, cognitive availability plummets.
They just can't learn.
Exactly. The child is no longer available to learn. Furthermore, this low muscle tone affects internal muscles too. It frequently causes dysphagia, which is difficulty swallowing.
Oh, that sounds dangerous.
It is. This leads to severe feeding difficulties and a really high risk of aspiration where food or liquid enters the lungs. Then you layer on top of that a high prevalence of seizures or epilepsy, which requires constant monitoring and recovery time.
My goodness.
Plus, there are common vision problems and potential abnormalities of the heart, gastrointestinal system, and even the skeletal structure.
I want to pause here because just looking at that list, hypotonia, dysphagia, seizures, skeletal issues, it is an overwhelming reality for a family to manage. But from the strict perspective of an educator, how does this medical profile impact cognition and communication?
Well, children with PRA generally have moderate to severe learning disabilities. This significantly impacts the speed and manner in which they process information.
Okay.
But the really striking educational hurdle is a profound delay in expressive communication. Many children with PRA are considered nonverbal.
Meaning they can't speak.
Right, meaning they cannot speak using words or phrases to express their needs, their thoughts, or their understanding of a subject.
But, the source data reveals something incredible here, a vital piece of insight that kind of changes the entire educational approach. Parents consistently report that children with PRA often have a very reasonable understanding when they are spoken to.
Yes, that is a crucial point.
Their receptive speech, like their ability to take in information, process it, and understand it, far outpaces their expressive speech.
That disconnect is the defining educational challenge of PURA syndrome. The brain is processing the information. The child understands the classroom environment. They understand the story being read. They understand the social dynamics of their peers.
Yeah.
But the neurological mechanism required to output a response, whether through articulate speech or coordinated motor function to write or sign, is fundamentally impaired.
It's like having a brilliantly high-powered computer tower, packed with processing speed, but you have no keyboard, no mouse, and no screen.
That's a perfect analogy.
The processing power is undeniably there, just humming away inside, but you cannot interact with it using standard off-the-shelf tools.
Yeah.
You need a highly specialized bespoke interface to get the data out.
Exactly.
So why does standard everyday education struggle so tragically to build that interface?
Well, standard education struggles because it's built on a model of mass efficiency and general recognizable milestones. Because PURA is so incredibly rare, your local mainstream school, or honestly even your local specialized SEN school, will likely have zero foundational experience with it.
They won't know what they're looking at.
They won't. They won't inherently understand the nuances of that massive gap between high receptive understanding and low expressive communication. The specialists who truly understand the mechanics of PURA are usually research clinicians found at major university hospitals. They aren't roaming the halls of a local primary school.
So the local school is effectively flying blind. I mean, they might see a nonverbal child and falsely assume a low cognitive ceiling rather than recognizing a massive expressive barrier.
Which is an absolute educational tragedy. Therefore, a legally binding document, the EHCP, is required. The EHCP forces the integration of specialized health, social, and educational care.
You need the law to step in.
You need the weight of the law to compel the local authority to take those university-level specialist insights, fund them, and mandate their delivery in the daily classroom environment. A standard school's goodwill or general special needs budget simply isn't robust enough to build that bespoke interface.
Right. Which brings us to the actual reality of this journey for the parents. Knowing what we're treating and knowing we ultimately need this legal document, where does the journey actually begin? Because, you don't just walk into a school on day one and demand an EHCP, do you? There is a precursor step.
Yes, there is. The journey begins with a tier called SEN Support. SEN stands for Special Educational Needs. This is the first universally accessible level of additional help provided to pupils in England.
Let's clarify a massive misconception right out of the gate here. Do parents need to wait for the genetics team to physically hand them the confirmed PURA syndrome paperwork before they can ask the school for SEN support?
Absolutely not. A child does not need a formal medical diagnosis to receive SEN support. The threshold is educational, not medical.
Oh, that's a huge relief.
It is. If a child is identified by a teacher or a parent as having special educational needs, meaning they have a learning difficulty or disability that calls for special educational provision to be made for them, the school must act immediately. Early identification is prioritized over waiting for a geneticist's signature.
Who is the quarterback for this support within the school? Like, who do you actually go talk to?
That would be the SENCO, the Special Educational Needs Coordinator. Every mainstream school in the UK is legally required to have a designated SENCO. They are the teacher responsible for coordinating all the provision for children with SEN.
Okay, so how does SEN support actually function? If a parent goes to the SENCO and says, my child is struggling with motor skills and communication, what is the mechanical process the school follows?
The SEN Code of Practice dictates that SEN support operates on a continuous four-part cycle known as Assess, Plan, Do, Review.
Assess, Plan, Do, Review.
First, they assess the child's specific needs. Then, they plan interventions in consultation with the parents. They do the interventions in the classroom. Finally, they review the progress after a set period, usually a term, and the cycle begins again based on those new findings.
It sounds incredibly methodical. What kind of interventions are we talking about at this tier?
At this level, it involves things the school can manage internally. It might mean differentiated teaching approaches, where the teacher breaks tasks down into smaller steps. It might involve small group work for phonics or social skills.
So relatively basic adjustments.
Right. They might introduce basic speech and language strategies recommended by a visiting therapist or provide specific sensory tools like a wobble cushion. Often, the school will formalize this by creating an IEP, an individual education plan, to outline these specific termly learning targets.
Okay, but if the school is required to assess, plan, and deliver all these interventions, why do we even need to move to the EHCP level?
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like SEN support has it covered.
This is where we hit the structural limitation of the UK education system. SEN support is funded entirely from the school's existing internal delegated budget.
Let's drill down into that budget. How does school funding actually work for special needs?
Mainstream schools receive a notional SNN budget as part of their overall funding from the government. The expectation from the local authority is that the school will use this budget to provide the first £6,000 worth of special educational provision for a child per year.
Wait, £6,000?
Yes. And that £6,000 has to cover the CENTO's time, the teaching assistants running the small groups, the sensory equipment, everything.
£6,000 for an entire academic year. For a child with PRA syndrome, who might need a dedicated, highly trained one-on-one specialist for feeding and physical safety, bespoke augmentative communication devices, daily physical therapy to combat hypotonia.
Exactly. That £6,000 budget is going to evaporate in the first few weeks of the term. The school simply cannot afford to deliver the level of specialized, multidisciplinary care required for a multi-system condition like PURA without bankrupting their resources for the rest of the school.
So the system is inherently designed to test the limits of local resources first. It basically forces the school to try everything within its financial power before anyone else steps in.
That is the exact architecture of the system. The local authority, which holds the larger external budget for special needs, wants to see undeniable proof that the school has exhausted its internal limit and that the child is still not making expected progress.
So what is the legal trigger then? When does a family definitively pivot from relying on the school's SEN support
Yeah.
to demanding an EHCP?
You trigger the pivot when the child is not making sufficient progress despite evidence-based SEN support interventions. You pivot when they require specialist teaching or therapy services that the school just cannot purchase.
Right.
You pivot when multiple professionals from health, social care, and education need a coordinated approach. Most crucially, you pivot when the financial cost of the provision required vastly exceeds what the school can reasonably be expected to provide from its own budget.
And for a child with PURA, you hit that ceiling almost instantly.
Almost instantly, yes.
Which means we are officially entering the EHCP pipeline. We have exhausted the local budget. We need the local authority to step in.
Yeah.
What is the starting line for this bureaucratic marathon? Like, how do you actually start the clock?
The clock starts the moment an official request for an EHC needs assessment is received by the local authority. This is commonly referred to in the paperwork as an EHCP, an Education, Health, and Care Assessment Request.
Okay, EHTR. Who holds the power to submit that request? Do you have to wait for the school to offer it?
Absolutely not. And this is a crucial right. While the CENSO at the school can and often does request it, parents and carers have the absolute legal right to ask the local authority directly.
You don't need the school's permission.
You do not need the school's permission. Furthermore, a doctor, a health professional, or even a family friend who believes an assessment is necessary can bring a child to the local authority's attention. Also, if a young person is aged 16 to 25, they have the legal right to request the assessment for themselves.
Let's walk through the timeline. A parent realizes the school cannot support their child. They bypass the wait and submit the EHCR to the local authority themselves. Day one begins. What is happening in those first critical 6 weeks?
Upon receiving the request, the local authority has a strict statutory deadline. Usually, within these first few weeks, they will contact the family, often arranging a meeting to explain the process and gather your initial perspectives.
Okay, that sounds positive.
It does, but internally, the LA is gathering the evidence of what the school has already attempted under SEN support. They are looking at the IEPs, the progress reports, and the school's financial breakdown.
They are essentially auditing the school to see if they really tried.
Precisely. Because by the end of week 6, the local authority must issue a legal decision. Are they going to conduct a full EHC needs assessment, or are they refusing to assess?
Hold on. You are telling me a parent can submit medical documentation of an ultra-rare genetic disorder like PURA syndrome, and after 6 weeks of waiting, a local authority panel can just say, no thanks, we aren't even going to look into this.
Yes.
How is that legal?
It is entirely legal, and unfortunately, it is a very common mechanism for managing tight local authority budgets. Submitting an EHC needs assessment request does not guarantee an assessment will actually happen.
That's terrifying.
The LA applies a legal test. They ask, first, whether the child has or may have special educational needs, and second, whether it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with an EHC plan. If they decide the school can manage the needs within their own budget, they will refuse to assess.
That is a massive roadblock at week 6. How does a parent arm themselves to prevent that refusal?
You prevent it by understanding that the burden of proof rests entirely on your shoulders from day one. You cannot wait until you apply for the EHCP to start gathering evidence.
So you have to be proactive.
Extremely proactive. If the LA refuses, by law, they must provide you with the reasons why and offer an opportunity for mediation or discussion. But the goal is to make your initial application so overwhelmingly evidenced that refusing it becomes legally indefensible.
Let's give the listener an actionable strategy here. We said we were going into the trenches. What does ironclad evidence actually look like? Because a parent might think, I'll just write down that my child had a really hard term and was exhausted.
And the local authority panel will dismiss that as anecdotal immediately. To build a watertight case, you need a forensic paper trail. The SA guidelines emphasize the importance of systematic documentation. You should utilize meeting notes templates every single time you interact with the school or a medical professional.
Let's contrast a bad meeting note with a legally powerful meeting note.
Okay, a poor note would say, met with the teacher. Tommy is struggling to pay attention in the afternoons and is too tired to do his phonics.
Which is just a general observation.
Exactly. A legally powerful note, one that forces the LA to act, translates the medical symptom directly to the educational deficit, it would say. met with SENCO, documented that due to PURA-related hypertonia, Tommy lacks the core muscular endurance to sit upright at his desk past 1:000 p.m.
So it brings in the medical diagnosis.
Right, and then it concludes, this physical inability directly resulted in him missing the entire afternoon phonics module, demonstrating that standard classroom furniture and pacing are actively preventing his access to the curriculum.
That is brilliant. You aren't just complaining, you are drawing a straight, undeniable line from the genetic diagnosis to the failure of the school's internal resources. You submit a stack of those logs with your EHCR, and suddenly the LA can't claim the school has it handled.
Exactly. You are proving beyond a doubt that SEN support has been exhausted.
Okay, let's assume the parent builds that watertight case. Week 6 arrives, and the local authority concedes. They say, yes, we agree we will conduct a full assessment. The investigation phase begins. This takes us from week 6 to week 12. What is actually happening during these 6 weeks of heavy lifting?
This is where the local authority is legally required to step out of their offices and actively gather formal written advice and information from a massive roster of professionals. They can no longer just look at the school's internal notes.
Who is on this legally mandated roster?
The LA must seek advice from you, the parent or carer. They must seek the views of the child themselves. They require a formal report from the educational setting. Crucially, they must get advice from an educational psychologist.
An educational psychologist. Okay.
They must also get medical advice and information from a healthcare professional, which is usually a community or consultant pediatrician. They must get advice from social care. And finally, they must gather reports from any other professionals who are actively working with your child, such as speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, or neurologists.
That is a staggering amount of coordination. Dozens of moving parts, all supposed to synchronize in a 6-week window.
It is, which is why deadlines are frequently missed by local authorities. But conceptually, this phase is the absolute most critical window for a complex condition like PURA syndrome. This is the moment where the dense medical realities we discussed earlier must be explicitly and formally translated into actionable educational needs by the experts.
I want to drill down into this translation concept again because it seems to be the linchpin of the whole system. What does that translation look like in a formal report from, say, a consultant pediatrician?
It is not enough for the pediatrician's report to simply list a diagnosis. If the doctor writes, the patient has a diagnosis of PURA syndrome presenting with epilepsy and dysphagia, the local authority funding panel will look at that and say, that's a medical issue, not an educational one. The health service can deal with it.
They will just compartmentalize it and refuse to fund support in the school.
Precisely. To secure educational funding, the medical specialist must bridge the gap. They must document how those clinical facts explicitly destroy the child's ability to learn.
How do they phrase that?
So, regarding epilepsy, the report must state, due to frequent absent seizures, the child experiences significant gaps in immediate memory and requires a designated quiet recovery space for 30 minutes post-seizure, followed by structured one-on-one catch-up time for the missed lesson.
The need dictates the provision. What about the swallowing issue, the dysphagia?
The translation there would be, due to severe dysphagia and high aspiration risk, the child cannot safely consume nutrition independently. Therefore, they require a specialized, medically trained feeding assistant during all lunch and snack hours to safely maintain the necessary caloric energy levels required for afternoon cognitive learning.
Wow. It always has to circle back to learning. Like, because of this medical issue, they need this specific support to access their education. If it doesn't make that final link, the local authority will not open their checkbook.
That is the harsh reality of this system. By week 12, all of these incredibly detailed reports from the psychologists, the doctors, the therapists, and the parents must be gathered. And the LA is bound by a week 12 deadline to synthesize all that advice into a drafted EHC plan.
So the draft is written at week 12. What happens between week 12 and week 16?
This is the proposed plan phase. The drafted document is submitted for internal approval within the local authority. This is where the unseen bureaucracy happens. Panels sit behind closed doors, reviewing the drafted needs and provisions, and having intense discussions around funding and resource allocation.
And then,
by the end of week 16, the LA must formally issue the proposed draft EHCP to the parents.
let's explore the worst-case scenario here. What if that internal closed-door panel looks at the draft, looks at the cost, and decides they don't want to approve it. Can they back out after 16 weeks of investigation?
They can. If the LA decides against issuing an EHCP after the full assessment, they are required to inform you. Usually what they do is issue the synthesized draft as a lesser SEN Support plan for the school to implement. It outlines the needs, but it comes without the legally binding external funding of an EHCP.
That would be absolutely devastating. 16 weeks of exhausting medical and psychological evaluations, only to be told the school has to manage it on their 6,000-pound budget anyway.
It is a profound blow, and it is a decision that parents immediately take to a tribunal appeal. But for the sake of our timeline today, let's assume the panel approves the need. The draft EHCP arrives on your doormat at week 16.
The physical document has arrived. This is the blueprint that will dictate the trajectory of your child's daily life.
And the clock instantly starts ticking the moment you open the envelope. You are given exactly 15 days by law.
Just 15 days.
15 days to read this highly complex legal document, give your views, make representations on the content, request amendments, and state your preference for which specific school you want named in the final plan.
15 days. That is 2 weeks and a day to counter a document the local authority spent 4 months building. That is the most critical high-pressure window in the entire process. A parent has to sit down at their kitchen table and dissect this draft like a forensic accountant looking for fraud.
That is exactly the mindset required. The EHCP is not written as a flowing narrative. It is divided into very strict, compartmentalized statutory sections labeled alphabetically from A to K. The anatomy of the document is rigid, and you must understand every piece of it.
Okay, let's break down the anatomy of this document. Section A.
Section A is dedicated to the views, interests, and aspirations of the child and their parents. It is the human element of the document.
Now, we discussed earlier that children with PURA are often nonverbal. How on earth does a parent legally capture and document the views and aspirations of a child who cannot speak?
This is a vital point. The law strictly requires a person-centered approach. The child cannot just be treated as a clinical file. For nonverbal children, parents must ensure that the specific methods used to determine the child's preferences are rigorously documented in Section A.
What kind of methods?
If you use visual communication boards, eye gaze technology, specialized communication devices, or even if you rely on the parent's close observation of the child's physical reactions and changing demeanors to different stimuli, all of those translation methods must be validated and written into Section A.
Oh, I see.
The local authority will often provide an all about me form to help capture this, but parents must be thorough. Section A sets the tone that this is an individual capable of preference and deserving of ambition.
So Section A is the humanizing context, but it's not the legal teeth of the document, is it? Where is the engine room of the EHCP?
The engine room, the absolute core of the legal contract, lies in Section B and Section F.
Let's look at B and F.
Section B is the comprehensive list of the child's special educational needs. Every single challenge, barrier, deficit, and diagnosis identified in all of those professional reports we gathered must be painstakingly listed here.
And Section F.
Section F details the special educational provision, the actual, tangible support required to meet the needs listed in B.
Think of Section B as a highly specific invoice of your child's deficits. Section F is the exact currency required to pay that invoice. There is a golden rule between these two sections, isn't there?
There is, and it is a strict lock and key mechanism. Every single need listed in Section B must have a corresponding specific provision listed in Section F to address it.
They have to match perfectly.
You cannot have an orphan need in B with no support in F, and you cannot ask for a provision in F if the need isn't legally established in B.
This brings us to what I think is the most brilliant, actionable piece of advice in this entire deep dive. How do you actually check a 30-page legal document for these lock and key matches in just 15 days? Let's walk through the color coding trick from the SAY guidelines.
It is a highly effective visual auditing strategy.
All right, so imagine you are sitting at your table. On your left, you place the draft EHCP. But before you even look at it, you look to your right, where you place Section K. Now, Section K is essentially the bibliography of the EHCP. It is the physical stack of all the professional reports the LA used, the psychologist's report, the speech therapist's report, the pediatrician's report.
You need them all laid out.
Exactly. You take that stack on the right, you get two bright highlighter pens, let's say yellow and pink. You read through the expert reports. Every single time a doctor or therapist identifies a need, you highlight it in yellow. Every single time they recommend a provision or an intervention, you highlight it in pink.
Then you go through those highlighted reports and you physically number them. Need 1, provision 1, need 2, provision 2, need 3, provision 3, all the way through the hundreds of points.
Exactly. You are creating your own master map of what the experts actually said. Once you have your numbered lists, you finally open the draft EHCP to sections B and F. You cross-reference your map against the local authority's draft. You are checking for a flawless one-to-one match.
Right.
You look at your map. Okay, the speech therapist identified need 17 severe expressive language delay. Is need 17 written into section B of the draft? If yes, you check the next step. The therapist recommended provision 17, a customized eye-gaze communication device. Did the LA include provision 17 in section F?
The reason parents must perform this forensic audit is that local authorities, quite frankly, sometimes omit expensive provisions that were clearly recommended by the professionals.
Just to save a buck.
They might try to water down a clinical recommendation to save money. If an intervention is stated in the professional report in section K, it legally should be integrated into the plan. The color coding trick ensures nothing is left behind in the translation.
And when you are auditing section F, the currency, the provisions there is a massive systemic red flag that parents must ruthlessly hunt down and eliminate. Vague language.
Absolutely. The law explicitly requires the local authority to specify the support. If you are reading section F and it says the child will have access to a speech therapist or opportunities for physiotherapy or regular input from an occupational therapist, you must cross that out immediately and demand an amendment.
Why? I mean, access to sounds positive.
Because access to means absolutely nothing in a court of law. It is legally hollow. Access to could mean the speech therapist walks past the child's classroom once a term and wades through the window. It cannot be enforced. The plan must detail exactly what the provision is, how often it will be delivered, how long each session will last, and who must deliver it.
Give me an example of ironclad specificity in section F.
A legally enforceable provision reads, the child will receive a 45-minute direct one-to-one intervention session focused on expressive communication using an augmentative device delivered by a qualified speech and language therapist once per week during the morning school session.
Wow, that's incredibly detailed.
That is a quantifiable contract. If the therapist doesn't show up for 45 minutes on Tuesday, the local authority has broken the law. Opportunities for speech therapy gives them an endless loophole. Specificity is your armor.
That is incredibly empowering. Okay, let's move down the alphabet. What about the goals? Where does the plan state what all this money and effort is actually trying to achieve? That's section E, correct?
Yes. Section E lists the outcomes sought for the child. It defines the benefit or the developmental difference that all these interventions in section F are supposed to actually make. And these outcomes are mandated to be SMART.
Right, the classic corporate acronym. Specific, measurable. What are the rest in the context of an EHCP? Achievable.
Achievable, realistic, and crucially for holding the school accountable. Time-bound. But there is a very specific nuance here dictated by the SEN Code of Practice. The outcomes must be intensely personal to the child. They must not be written from a service perspective.
What does a service perspective look like versus a personal outcome?
A service perspective outcome would be written as, the local authority will provide 10 hours of physiotherapy this year. That is entirely wrong. That is a provision, not an outcome. That is just stating what the adults are going to do.
So what's the right way?
A legally compliant personal outcome focuses on the child's achievement. It should read, by the end of Key Stage 2, the child will have developed the core strength to bear their own weight for 60 seconds, enabling them to transfer from their wheelchair to the toilet independently. That is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound.
We've covered A, B, E, F, and K. There are some sections that families often gloss over because they are so focused on the classroom. Let's talk about sections H1 and H2.
These deal exclusively with social care provision resulting from the child's special educational needs.
Why do these sections get ignored?
Because the document is called an Education, Health, and Care Plan, everyone hyper-focuses on the education part. But social care is a massive, vital pillar, especially for families managing a complex, multi-system condition like P or RA syndrome. Section H1 covers statutory provision under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act of 1970. This can include practical assistance in the home or adaptations to the house.
And H2.
Section H2 covers other social care provisions reasonably required by the learning difficulty. This can literally be life-saving for a family unit on the brink of burnout. It includes things like short-term school holiday support, provisions for emergency care if a parent is suddenly unwell, or intensive support at home after a child undergoes a surgery.
We're talking about respite care, acknowledging that if the family unit collapses, the child's education collapses. The EHCP can legally mandate support to keep the parents functional.
Exactly. It recognizes the holistic ecosystem of the child's life.
Let's move to a section that causes massive confusion during this 15-day draft period. The school name. Where does that go?
The name and type of the school or institution to be attended goes in Section On. Now here's the part that panics many parents. When you receive that draft EHCP at week 16, Section I will be completely blank.
I can imagine a parent tearing through the document to see if they got the special school they wanted and finding an empty box. Why on earth is it blank?
It is blank by legal design. The 15-day draft review period is specifically the window where you, the parent, formally tell the local authority your preference of school.
Ah, so you get to choose.
Well, you state your preference. The LA legally cannot name a school until you have had the opportunity to review the finalized needs in B and provisions in F, and then state which school you believe can deliver them. You use these 15 days to say, based on this draft, I want X specialist school. The LA then consults with that school. The actual name of the school will only appear when the absolute final plan is issued.
That makes sense, but it is definitely a shock if you aren't expecting it. And finally, what is Section J?
Section J details any personal budgets. A personal budget is an amount of money identified by the local authority to deliver provisions set out in an EHCP where the parent is involved in securing that provision.
How does a parent actually manage a personal budget? Do they just get a check in the mail?
There are a few mechanisms. You can request direct payments, where the local authority literally gives you the funding directly, and you act as the employer to buy and manage the specialized services yourself, perhaps hiring your own independent speech therapist who knows PURA syndrome, rather than using the LA's general staff.
That sounds like a lot of administrative work for the parent, managing payroll and contracts.
It is, which is why there is an alternative called notional arrangements. This is where the local authority or the school retains the money and manages the contracts, but you, the parent, have the directing voice in exactly how those funds are spent and which specific professionals are commissioned.
Oh, that's much better.
It gives you the control without the payroll headache. Section J outlines exactly which mechanism is being used and for how much.
Okay, we have navigated the anatomy. You have color-coded the draft. You've aggressively crossed out vague language. You have demanded smart outcomes. And you have submitted your preferred school within the 15-day window. What does the finish line of this initial marathon look like?
The statutory finish line is the 20-week mark. By law, the finalized EHCP must be formally issued within 20 weeks of your initial request for an assessment back at day 1.
20 weeks. 5 months of relentless advocacy.
And once that final plan is issued, the dynamic completely shifts. It is now a legally binding document. The local authority no longer has a choice. They must secure the exact provisions specified in Section F.
I can imagine the sheer wave of relief when that final document arrives.
Yeah.
But the reality is, a child isn't static. A child with PURA syndrome is going to grow, their medical needs might shift, their cognitive profile might change. You don't just put the EHCP in a drawer until they turn 18. How do you maintain the relevance of this plan?
You are absolutely right. The EHCP is meant to be a living document. It is managed and updated through the annual review process. By law, the plan must be formally reviewed by the local authority at least every 12 months. Now, a crucial caveat. If the child is under 5 years old, their development is so rapid that the plan should be reviewed every 3 to 6 months.
An annual review sounds like another massive bureaucratic hurdle. How should a parent prepare for this? Do you have to start from scratch?
You don't start from scratch, but it requires serious preparation. You need to gather evidence from the entirety of the past year. You collect the school's progress reports, recent medical test results, and most importantly, your own continuous diary entries.
Their own records are that important.
Incredibly important. If there have been new challenges, perhaps an increase in seizure frequency, bouts of anxiety, or attendance issues due to hospital visits, you must document them. The school or the LA will also request updated reports from the professionals involved.
As a parent, do you have a right to see those updated professional reports before you walk into the review meeting? Or do they just spring them on you?
Crucially, yes. The law states the school must circulate all updated professional reports to you at least 2 weeks before the review meeting. If you are a week out and you haven't received them, you must contact the SENSCO immediately and demand them. Never walk into an annual review meeting blind to what the professionals are claiming.
Let's talk about the meeting itself. It's usually chaired by this ENSCO, right?
Mm-hmm.
It brings together the parents, the teachers, and the specialists to discuss the progress against those SMART outcomes in Section E.
Yes. But I want to be very transparent with parents listening. These meetings are notoriously difficult. They carry a heavy emotional toll.
Why are they so difficult? You have the funding now. Shouldn't it be a collaborative check-in?
Because the entire system is built on a deficit model. You are sitting in a room, often for an hour or more, listening to a panel of professionals systematically dissect every single thing your child cannot do. The reports focus heavily on deficits, delays, and failures to meet milestones.
That sounds grueling.
Why? Because that negative framing is how you continue to legally secure the funding. You have to constantly prove the ongoing severity of the need.
So you have to highlight the worst days to get support for the best days. That must be an exhausting narrative for a parent to constantly reinforce.
It is incredibly taxing. My advice to parents is to mentally prepare themselves for that emotional onslaught before walking into the room. Stay calm, detach from the emotional sting of the medical language, and stay ruthlessly focused on the objective, ensuring the plan is updated to meet your child's current reality. And remember, you do not have to do this alone.
Who can parents bring with them?
If you feel overwhelmed, you can bring an advocate. A fantastic resource is someone from your local SENDIAS organization.
Let's define SENDIAS for the listener.
It stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, Information Advice and Support Services. Every local authority in the UK is legally required to fund a SENDIAS service, but they operate independently from the local authority.
So they are on your side.
Yes. They are essentially free, impartial, expert guides provided by law to help families navigate this exact process. They can sit in that review meeting with you, take notes, and ensure the school isn't skirting their legal duties.
What happens if things change drastically in the middle of the year? Let's say a child with PURA develops a severe new swallowing complication in November, but the annual review isn't until May. Do you just have to wait for the clock to run out while the child suffers?
No. You can request an early review, sometimes called an emergency review. You write formally to the local authority, providing the new medical evidence of the significant change in circumstances, and demand an early review. The plan must accurately reflect the current reality of the child. It cannot wait 6 months if the provision is no longer safe or adequate.
And as the child gets older, does the nature of the review change?
It does. From year 9 onward, so around age 13 or 14, the annual review legally shifts its focus. It becomes a phase transfer or preparation for adulthood review. The conversation expands outwards from just classroom education to planning for independent living, community participation, and future employment or adult care transitions. The EHCP can actually legally remain in place up to the age of 25 if the young person remains in education or training.
We have painted a very structured, somewhat ideal path here, but we have to talk about what happens when the system breaks down. What if the local authority simply refuses to play by the rules? They refuse to assess at week 6, or you get the final plan at week 20 and Section F is full of vague nonsense, or they name a mainstream school in Section I that you absolutely know cannot handle the complex medical reality of PURA syndrome. What is your recourse when the system says no?
Your ultimate recourse is the SEN Tribunal. You have a statutory right to appeal the decisions of the local authority to an independent national judicial body.
What exactly falls under the jurisdiction of the tribunal? What can you appeal?
You can appeal the LA's refusal to carry out an initial EHC assessment. You can appeal the refusal to issue a plan after an assessment is completed. You can appeal refusal to reassess. And most commonly, you can appeal the actual contents of the final EHC plan specifically. You can challenge the needs identified in Section B, the provisions detailed in Section F, or the specific educational institution named in Section 1.
Are there elements of this frustrating process that you cannot take to a tribunal?
Yes, and this distinction is vital for parents to understand so they don't waste energy on the wrong legal avenue. You cannot appeal to the tribunal about how a school is delivering SEN support if you do not have an EHCP. Furthermore, if you do have a finalized EHCP and the school or the LA is simply failing to actually provide the therapy written in Section F, meaning they agree on the plan but are just breaking the contract, that is not a tribunal issue.
Wait, if they're breaking the legal contract of the EHCP, where do you go if not the tribunal?
If they are failing to deliver specified provision, that is a matter for a judicial review in the High Court, or a formal complaint to the local government and social care ombudsman. The tribunal is there to argue about what should be in the plan, Judicial review is there to enforce what is already in the plan.
Oh, that makes sense.
Also, you generally cannot appeal missed deadlines by the LA to the tribunal, and you cannot appeal school transport issues unless the transport dispute is intrinsically legally tied to the specific school being named in Section 1.
Let's take a step back and look at the sheer scale of what we have just discussed. We've gone from the microscopic genetics of chromosome 5 through school funding limits, the 20-week statutory timeline, color-coding forensic audits, defining smart outcomes, battling vague language, and threatening judicial reviews. A parent of a child with PURA syndrome listening to this, they aren't just a caregiver. They can't just be a mom or a dad helping with homework.
No, they cannot. The reality of the UK system dictates that they have to become a project manager. They have to become a legally literate advocate. They have to act as a forensic record keeper and a ruthless negotiator.
It is entirely a second, unpaid full-time job.
It is. The burden of proof, the burden of coordination, and the burden of enforcement rests almost entirely on the family to force the system to see their child clearly and support them legally.
To briefly recap this massive journey for our listeners, we started by deeply understanding that PRA's unique profile, specifically that heartbreaking but hopeful gap between a child's high receptive understanding and their low expressive ability, requires bespoke, legally binding support that a standard school cannot invent on its own.
Exactly.
We talked about why you must push past the 6,000-pound funding limits of basic SEN support. We mapped out the strict, unforgiving 20-week timeline from the initial EHCP request to the finalized plan.
The whole marathon.
Yeah. We gave you the color-coding strategy to absolutely dominate the draft checking phase in those crucial 15 days, ensuring every single need in Section B matches a paid-for provision in Section F. And we explored how to manage the intense emotional and administrative gauntlet of the annual review and your right to appeal to the tribunal.
The system is a maze, and it is complex. But it is built on a very rigid structure of laws. And when parents understand that structure, they transition from asking for help to demanding statutory compliance. They can hold the authorities accountable to the letter of the law.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you navigate this paperwork. Something that really struck me while we were digging through all this legislation and the clinical reality of PRA syndrome. The entire EHCP system, by its very nature, is built on a deficit model.
It is.
It forces parents, doctors, and teachers to spend months documenting in granular, exhaustive, often painful detail every single thing a child cannot do. You have to prove how broken the situation is. You have to catalog every failure and every physical limitation just to secure the funding to fix it.
It is a paradoxical system. It demands that you highlight the absolute worst days and the deepest limitations to unlock the support necessary for the best days.
But think about what happens after. Once you have survived that battlefield, once that legal binder is locked in, the funding is secured, the specialized communication device is on the desk, and the one-on-one support is legally mandated. How might reshaping the daily narrative around a child's potential change everything, especially for a child with PRA syndrome, whose receptive understanding, their inner world, their comprehension, far exceeds their physical ability to express it?
That is the big question.
Once the grueling paperwork of the deficit model is finally done, what happens if we as a society and as educators stop focusing on the deficit and start teaching to that hidden high-powered potential? If we assume intelligence rather than assuming delay, how might that fundamentally change the trajectory of their education and maybe how our entire society views the ceiling of special needs entirely?
That is the beautiful, vital work. Securing the EHCP is just building the foundation. Cultivating that hidden potential is the real work that begins after the ink is dry.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We know this is a massive undertaking, but you are not alone. Keep documenting, keep advocating, and stay strong out there.